Have you ever noticed how someone who feels emotionally unavailable can still take up so much space in your mind? You go over past conversations again and again. You try to read between the lines. You feel a strange sense of closeness even when they are silent or distant. And here is something most people don't realize. When an avoidant type keeps showing up in your thoughts, it's often not random. It can also mean you've stirred something within them too, just in a quieter, more confusing way than people expect. So if you've been wondering whether they think about you or why you feel such a pull, there are deeper internal processes already happening on their side, whether they express them or not. When someone with avoidant patterns can't stop thinking about you, it usually starts because you've touched something deeper than surface attraction. You've disrupted their internal sense of emotional control, not in a dramatic panic way, but in a subtle shift that makes them feel less steady than usual inside. Avoidant individuals tend to feel safest when they can manage emotional distance, personal space, and the pace of connection. But you didn't follow that pattern. You showed up in a way that felt real and emotionally present. Maybe you listened without pressure. Maybe you offered understanding without demanding closeness. That kind of presence creates something unexpected for them. Emotional safety that doesn't feel controlling. And that's where the inner tension begins. Because real emotional safety naturally invites closeness, and closeness challenges their learned habit of distance. So instead of moving toward you openly, their mind starts circling around the experience, trying to understand what just happened inside them. You become something their nervous system tries to decode. Not just a person they met, but a feeling they can't easily categorize. One part of them recognizes something meaningful and grounding, while another part feels uncertain about how to stay in control without pulling away. This creates internal exhaustion. When they are distracted, working, or physically occupied, they may feel fine, but in quiet moments, you return to their thoughts not as a fantasy, but as a question they can't fully answer. Why did that feel different? Why do I keep remembering that moment? Why did your presence feel both comforting and unsettling at the same time? And this is where most people misunderstand avoidant behavior. Their emotional response doesn't usually lead to immediate action. It leads to analysis. They replay interactions, rethink words, and try to understand emotions logically, as if logic could fully contain what they are feeling. But the more they try to control or suppress it, the more persistent it becomes underneath. That is why they may appear distant, inconsistent, or slow to respond emotionally. It's not always lack of feeling. Sometimes it's the opposite, feeling something they don't yet know how to hold. In a way, you interrupt their emotional autopilot. And once that happens, you are not easily removed from their mental space. If you find yourself constantly thinking about them, there is a strong chance you've already created the same kind of imprint on their inner world. What they feel rarely shows up in obvious actions. There may be no long messages, no emotional confessions, no visible signs. Most of it happens internally, in private moments no one sees. Avoidant types process emotions inwardly, so even when they seem distant, you may still exist very clearly in their thoughts. During quiet parts of the day, while driving, hearing music, or passing familiar reminders, you reappear in their mind. But instead of expressing it, they hold it back. Opening up emotionally feels risky to them. It can feel like losing control, becoming vulnerable, or stepping into expectations they are not ready for. So instead of reaching out, they retreat into thought. This is where misunderstanding often grows. Silence can look like disinterest, but for them, silence is often where emotion is happening the most. They revisit moments, question meanings, and try to understand how close things actually felt. You become an unresolved presence in their mind, something not dismissed, but something mentally processed over time. And something important to understand is that avoidant individuals often feel emotions more intensely when there is distance. When you are not directly in front of them, their defenses are lower. Thinking feels safer than expressing, so your absence can actually make your presence in their mind stronger. On the outside, they may look calm. Internally, they may feel unsettled, restless, or slightly off balance without fully naming why. They don't usually explain this to others, and they rarely label it as missing someone. Instead, it comes out as distraction or overthinking, or a quiet sense that something is unfinished. They tend to sit with these feelings instead of rushing to resolve them. They test emotions against distance, trying to see if they fade or stay. And if you continue to appear in their thoughts without effort, it usually means the connection reached a level that isn't easy for them to dismiss. So even if you don't see clear signs, that doesn't mean nothing is happening internally. With avoidant patterns, the most important processes are usually hidden. When an avoidant starts feeling a real emotional pull, it doesn't create clarity. It creates contradiction. One moment they feel drawn in, calm, and connected to you. The next moment, their internal system reacts as if closeness itself is something risky. That push and pull becomes the core experience. One side wants connection, understanding, and emotional closeness. The other side fears dependence, loss of independence, and being emotionally exposed too deeply. And that inner conflict is exactly what keeps you present in their mind, even when they don't fully understand what to do with it. When these two forces collide, his mind doesn't slow down, it speeds up. He feels pulled toward closeness, and then almost immediately senses the need to step away. Not because the feeling is gone, but because it suddenly feels stronger than before. And that's where the quiet discomfort begins. It doesn't usually show up as obvious panic or visible anxiety. It's more subtle than that. It's the internal pressure of feeling emotionally seen in a way he isn't fully used to. His system starts interpreting closeness as something intense, something that needs managing. The more he cares, the more his instinct pushes him to regain distance, as if space will bring everything back under control. This is where the mixed signals often come in. Warm engagement followed by withdrawal, interest followed by silence. From the outside, it looks inconsistent, but internally, it's a reflex pattern, not a deliberate decision. For many avoidant individuals, emotional closeness was not always experienced as something safe or steady in earlier life. It may have been linked with overwhelm, expectations, or emotional pressure. So when something real starts forming, their nervous system reacts automatically by creating distance, even if their emotional side hasn't disconnected at all. And this is where it becomes confusing for you. The moment he steps back, it might look like the connection has weakened, but internally, the pull doesn't disappear. In many cases, it becomes even more noticeable. Distance reduces emotional intensity on the surface, but it increases mental presence underneath. That's why he can seem calmer outwardly while still thinking about you in the background. This internal push and pull creates hesitation in how he responds. He may delay messages, avoid defining what the connection is, or keep things unclear. Not because he lacks feeling, but because clarity would force him to face the depth of what he actually feels. And that brings vulnerability he isn't fully ready to sit with. Avoidants often choose uncertainty over emotional exposure. Uncertainty feels safer because it doesn't demand a full emotional position. So if you're noticing that internal tug of war, it's often not a sign of absence. It's a sign of conflict. He feels something real, but doesn't yet know how to hold it without pulling back from it at the same time. When someone starts staying on his mind consistently, it usually means they've crossed a threshold from being simply interesting to becoming emotionally significant. And that kind of significance is not something he assigns lightly. It means you've affected him in a way that doesn't fit neatly into his usual way of processing people. Emotional significance often begins when you make him feel understood without pressure. You didn't force closeness, you didn't demand reassurance, and you didn't create emotional urgency. Instead, there was presence with space. And for an avoidant pattern, that combination is uncommon, and it bypasses their usual defenses. Because of that, he doesn't just replay what you said, he replays what it meant. Certain moments stay in his mind not because they were dramatic, but because they disrupted his usual emotional expectations. You didn't fit into a predictable category, and that creates a kind of quiet mental fixation. The strange part is that emotional significance doesn't always lead to immediate action. In many cases, it slows things down. Acting would mean acknowledging vulnerability. It would mean admitting that someone now has emotional weight. So instead of moving forward, he stays in thought, processing internally, trying to understand without losing control. Over time, this turns into attachment, even if he never labels it that way. He might describe it as curiosity, reflection, or just overthinking. But if your presence keeps returning in his mind, it's because you've become part of his internal emotional landscape in a way that isn't easy to remove. This is also why he may seem cautious with the connection. He might keep it undefined, slow, or emotionally contained, not because he wants to lose it, but because he doesn't fully trust his ability to handle something that actually matters without retreating from it. So when you wonder whether you mattered, understand this. Avoidant patterns don't struggle with people who are insignificant. They struggle with the ones who create internal disruption, the ones who stay present even when distance is created, and that is exactly what distance is for him. It isn't always an ending. Often, it's a form of emotional testing. He steps away not to erase the connection, but to see what remains when he does, whether the feeling fades or whether it continues without immediate contact. Because avoidants tend to regulate emotion through separation, distance becomes a way to calm the nervous system while still keeping the connection mentally active. So, while he appears to pull back, internally he is still tracking the emotional thread, checking whether it is still there, still active, still affecting him. And when it is, it doesn't always bring comfort. It brings realization, because what he hoped distance would soften often continues to exist anyway. It wasn't just closeness or routine. You stay in his mind because you reached him emotionally, not because of circumstance. And for someone who depends on independence to feel secure, that realization doesn't feel simple. It feels unsettling. From the outside, it can easily be mistaken for disinterest. Fewer messages, slower replies, less effort, less visible initiative. But internally, something very different is happening. There is reflection, comparison, and quiet questioning taking place beneath the surface. He starts asking himself things he would never say out loud. Why am I still thinking about her? Why does this feel unresolved? Why didn't distance make it fade like I expected it to? And here's what matters. If distance truly fixed it, you wouldn't remain in his mental space for long. People who don't carry emotional weight tend to fade naturally when there's space. But when someone continues to appear in thought even after withdrawal, it usually signals that something deeper was formed. That's why this phase becomes a kind of internal test. Instead of moving forward quickly, he sits with the feeling, observes it from different angles, and tries to return himself to emotional balance before making any clear decision. Avoidant patterns don't rush clarity. They delay it in an attempt to regain control over how they feel. And because of that, pushing for answers during this stage often creates the opposite effect. What could have been reflection turns into retreat. What could have been processing turns into further distancing. So when he pulls back but still lingers in your awareness, that contradiction itself becomes important. Distance for him is not always a conclusion. More often, it is a question he is trying to answer internally rather than externally. And while he is away, he is not necessarily absent. Mentally, he is still checking the connection. He notices whether your presence fades, whether memories lose weight, whether time reduces the emotional impact. But when it doesn't, it creates more internal tension than relief. Because what he hoped distance would dissolve continues to remain. It wasn't just proximity. It wasn't just habit. You stay present in his thoughts because the connection reached him on an emotional level, not a situational one. And that kind of impact is harder to dismiss than simple familiarity. From the outside, this can still look like indifference. Less effort, less communication, less visible pursuit. But internally, he is evaluating everything. He is trying to understand why something still feels unfinished, why silence hasn't brought clarity, and why the emotional thread hasn't fully broken. If distance truly worked in the way he unconsciously hoped, you would have faded by now. But the fact that you haven't is exactly what keeps the internal conflict alive. Something real was formed, even if it was never clearly defined. This stage can last longer than most people expect because avoidant patterns don't resolve feelings quickly. They sit with them, analyze them, and wait for emotional equilibrium before taking any step forward. It is a slow, internal negotiation rather than a direct emotional response. That's why forcing clarity too soon rarely helps. It doesn't create connection. It increases withdrawal. The system isn't ready for resolution yet. It is still trying to understand what it is feeling in the first place. So if he feels distant, but still emotionally present in your awareness, that tension itself is meaningful. Distance, in this context, is not always an ending. It is often an internal question still in progress. And when someone keeps occupying his thoughts despite space, it usually means the connection has already survived the very thing meant to weaken it. When an avoidant can't stop thinking about someone, the fear is rarely about the other person doing something wrong. It is about what that person represents emotionally. You are no longer just someone he knows. You are someone who carries emotional weight. And for a person who has learned to stay safe through emotional self-control, weight feels like risk. Even when the connection feels good, that depth introduces hesitation. Not because something is wrong, but because caring now comes with consequence. It means he can be affected. It means disappointment becomes possible. It means emotional dependence could form in ways he isn't fully prepared to manage. So instead of moving closer, he builds distance in subtle ways. He slows down. He becomes less direct. He may intellectualize the connection, label it as uncertainty, or convince himself he needs more space to think clearly. On the surface, it looks like logic. Underneath it, it is vulnerability being managed. And what makes this more complex is that the fear only exists because the connection is real. If it didn't matter, there would be no hesitation, no internal dialogue, no emotional resistance. He would simply move on without reflection. But he doesn't. Because even with fear present, you remain in his thoughts, not as noise, but as something that holds weight. One part of him wants connection. Another part is trying to stay safe. And between those two forces, you remain present in his inner world. Not fully approached, not fully released. And that is exactly what keeps the push and pull alive. So in the end, what this really shows is simple. Distance didn't erase the connection, and silence didn't empty it. It only revealed that what was formed between you had enough emotional depth to survive both. And whether it moves forward or stays unfinished, one truth remains the same. When something continues to live in someone's thoughts even after space, it was never just a passing moment. It was something that left a mark.